On the night of September 7th, 1934, the captain of a luxury liner died suddenly in his quarters. A few hours later, in the dark before dawn, that same ship burst into flames, burned out of control, and killed more than 130 people. Two catastrophes on the same ship, on the same night, just hours apart. The captain's death, it turned out, had a medical explanation, but the fire never did. 90 years later, no one can say for certain how the Morro Castle really burned, or whether someone made it happen. Let's start with the ship, because for most of her short life, she was a symbol of the good times. The Morro Castle was a sleek modern ocean liner that ran a popular route between New York and Havana, Cuba. In the middle of America's Prohibition years, she offered exactly what people wanted: a few days at sea, warm weather, and once she reached international waters, all the drinking and dancing you could handle. She was fast, she was glamorous, and she was usually full of people having the time of their lives. On September 5th, 1934, she left Havana for the return trip to New York, carrying more than 500 passengers and crew. For 2 days, everything was normal, and then, on the evening of the 7th, the first strange thing happened. Captain Robert Wilmot, the experienced commander of the Morro Castle, told his steward that he wasn't feeling well. He had a meal sent to his quarters, and a short time later, he was found dead. The ship's doctor examined him and attributed the death to a heart attack, recorded in the language of the day as indigestion and heart failure. It was not on its face suspicious. Captains are human. Hearts fail. A man in his 50s dying of a sudden cardiac event is one of the most ordinary tragedies there is. But the timing has always unsettled people, because the captain did not die in the middle of an uneventful voyage. He died on the last night of the trip, mere hours before his ship would be consumed by a fire that no one could explain. And in the years that followed, that coincidence, the captain gone and then the flames, would sit at the center of everything anyone suspected about the Morro Castle. Hold on to it. We'll come back to it. With the captain dead, command passed to his chief officer, William Worms. And for a few hours, the ship sailed on through the night up the American coast, most of the passengers asleep in their cabins, unaware that their captain was gone. Then, at around 10 minutes to 3 in the morning, a crew member discovered a fire in a storage locker inside the ship. At first, it might have seemed containable, but the Morro Castle turned out to be a floating fire trap. She was full of the beautiful flammable materials of a 1930s luxury liner: polished wood paneling, varnish, oil, and paint. And the fire moved through her like she was built of kindling. Worse, as it spread, it burned through the ship's electrical wiring, and when those cables failed, the lights went out. The entire ship was plunged into darkness, a maze of smoke-filled corridors, on fire in the middle of the night, packed with hundreds of terrified passengers who had woken to a nightmare. What followed was horror and failure tangled together. The response was, by many accounts, a disaster of its own. There were breakdowns in fighting the fire and in organizing the evacuation. Some crew members reached the lifeboats before the passengers did. People were trapped by the flames, forced to choose between burning and jumping into the dark ocean far below. Many jumped, some drowned, Some were killed by the fall. The burning ship drifted out of control toward the New Jersey shore until she finally ran aground near the beach at Asbury Park, a giant glowing wreck close enough to land that crowds gathered on the sand to watch her burn. When the counting was done, the dead numbered more than 130. You'll see the figure given as 134 in some official records and 137 in others. Either way, it was a staggering loss of life on a routine holiday cruise. And then came one of the strangest chapters of all, what happened after the fire. The burnt-out hull did not sink. Driven by wind and current, the smoldering wreck ran aground in the shallows right off Asbury Park, one of the most popular beach resorts on the Jersey shore, and there she sat, a scorched steel giant, close enough to touch. What should have been treated as a grave site instead became a macabre tourist attraction. Sightseers poured into the town to gawk at the wreck. Vendors sold postcards and trinkets. Small boats charged people for a closer look. A disaster that had killed more than 130 human beings was, within days, turned into a spectacle and a business. A grim early example of how a tragedy can become entertainment almost before the survivors have stopped grieving. For the people who had actually lived through that night, jumping into a black ocean to escape the flames, the circus on the beach must have felt like a second insult on top of the first. If you're the kind of person who can't resist an unsolved mystery, this is the moment to subscribe, because the strangest part of this story isn't the fire itself, it's the man who became famous for it. Now, back to that night. In the middle of the chaos, as the ship burned and the power failed, one crew member stayed at his post, the chief radio operator, a man named George Rogers. With the ship dying around him, Rogers sent out the distress call that helped bring rescuers to the scene. In the days after the disaster, he was celebrated as a hero, the brave radio man who stuck to his station and saved lives. He gave interviews. He was praised in the newspapers. For a while, George Rogers was the one bright spot in a terrible story. And then, over the following years, the picture of George Rogers began to change. It turned out he was a deeply troubled man. Some years after the Morro Castle, Rogers was working for a police department in New Jersey when he tried to murder a colleague using a homemade incendiary device, a bomb designed to burn. He was convicted and sent to prison. Later still, he would be convicted in a separate killing. This is not speculation. These are documented crimes. The celebrated hero of the Morro Castle fire was, we now know for certain, a man who used fire as a weapon against other people and who was capable of murder. And that revelation sent investigators and writers back to the fire with new eyes. Because look at the pattern. A blaze that started in an enclosed storage locker, an odd place for an accident. A fire that spread with unusual speed and ferocity. Flames in the small hours when almost everyone was asleep and least able to respond. A captain conveniently dead the night before. And a hero at the radio who, years later, turned out to build firebombs for a hobby. It is not hard to see why so many people became convinced that George Rogers set the Morro Castle alight himself, and one of his later victims spent much of his life trying to prove exactly that. But here is where we have to be honest with you, because this is a true story and not a courtroom drama. Rogers was never charged with the Morro Castle fire. The official investigation ruled the cause of the fire undetermined. It was never established that anyone set it deliberately, and it was certainly never proven that Rogers did. He is a man who almost certainly could have done it, whose later crimes look eerily similar. And that is not the same thing as knowing that he did. And look honestly at the other explanation too, because it is just as unsettling. Ships of that era were genuinely dangerous, floating collections of varnish, oil, and polished wood, with fire precautions that look reckless to modern eyes. The crew was inexperienced with real emergencies and, by many accounts, badly led once the captain was gone. Doors that should have been closed were open. Equipment failed. Drills had been neglected. In other words, you don't actually need a villain to explain the Morro Castle. A careless spark in the wrong locker, on a floating fire trap, in the hands of a panicked and poorly trained crew, is more than enough to kill more than 130 people. The disaster is horrifying precisely because it might be nothing more than ordinary negligence taken to its most extreme conclusion. That is the trap this story sets for everyone who studies it. The arson theory is seductive because it has a face and a motive. The accident theory is bleaker because it doesn't. It just has human carelessness, which kills far more people than any arsonist ever has. And the evidence, 90 years on, refuses to settle the argument either way. What about the captain, then? The death that started this whole story? Here, at least, we have an answer, and it's important to be fair to the facts. Captain Wilmot's remains were eventually recovered from the ruins of his cabin, and they were examined by one of the most respected toxicologists in the country. The finding was clear. There was no trace of poison. The metals found on his remains came from the melted fittings of the burned-out ship, not from any attempt on his life. As far as the evidence goes, Robert Wilmot died of a heart attack, exactly as the ship's doctor first said. There is no proof that anyone killed him. And yet, a captain drops dead of a heart attack on the last night of the voyage, and hours later his ship burns in a fire no one can explain, made famous by a man who would later be convicted of using fire to hurt people. Two events side by side, one of them medically explained and one of them never solved, close enough to feel connected and impossible to actually connect. That is the real ghost of the Morro Castle, not a proven murderer. Something worse, in a way, the not knowing. The sense that something was very wrong on that ship, that the pieces almost fit, and that whatever the full truth was, it burned up along with the evidence off the coast of New Jersey. The disaster did leave one clear legacy. The sheer scale of the failure, the flammable materials, the darkness, the poor response, shocked the world into action and led to sweeping new laws about fire safety at sea. Fireproof materials, better drills, better alarms, clearer chains of command in an emergency. In that sense, the people who died on the Morro Castle did not die for nothing. Their deaths made every ship that came after a little safer. But the central question, the one you came here for, remains exactly as open as it was on that dark morning in 1934. So I'm going to hand it to you. Take everything you've just heard, The flammable ship, the failed response, the celebrated hero who turned out to build firebombs. In your gut, do you think the Morro Castle was a terrible accident, or do you think someone burned her on purpose? And just to be clear, no one has ever proven it either way. So this really is your call. Make your case in the comments. I read them, and I want to know where you land. And if you like a mystery that history never quite managed to solve, you already know there are more where this came from.